The latter half of the 19th century has been called the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. The inhospitable regions of Antarctic and Arctic still remained as undiscovered, and the areas were shrouded by the mysteries of the human mind. This era is marked by remarkable feats of endurance, scientific discovery, and a spirit of adventure. Key expeditions during this time were characterized by their daring nature and often limited technology. A very special expedition also takes place in this era. S.A. Andrée was a Swedish aeronaut and polar explorer. He was trying to reach the North Pole as the first person in the world, but it would happen by a hydrogen balloon. Andrée was supposed to fly much further on the same trip, along the northern coast of Russia all the way to Canada. This is the story of the ill-fated expedition. Andrée's attempt to reach the North Pole with a hydrogen balloon. Chapter 1. The Swedish Setup for the Global Polar Exploration. Sweden, despite its early contributions to polar exploration, had been noted to lag behind other nations, like Norway, in recent years in terms of polar research and expeditions. This trend was attributed to several factors, including funding limitations, prioritization of other scientific areas, and logistical challenges. But the situation would soon change when the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and public figures, such as Alfred Nobel and King Oscar II, began funding research into the polar expedition. It also set in motion a huge national interest, enthusiasm towards the yet unknown Arctic regions and exploration. What became later known as the Andrée's balloon expedition was motivated by a sense of national pride. Sweden, like many other European countries, was eager to assert itself in the field of exploration. Andrée managed to garner significant support from the Swedish government. Chapter 2. How Andrée's expedition emerged. Not much is known of Andrée's childhood, but he was born in 1854 in a small town of Gränna, the Jönköping County, on the eastern shores of Lake Vättern. In 1876, after obtaining a degree in mechanical engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Andrée made a trip to the United States of America to expand his views and to gain new ideas, share his thoughts with foreign colleagues. He took part the Centennial Exposition, the first official World's Fair in the U.S. During his trip, Andrée met John Wise, the American who was a pioneer in the field of ballooning. Wise had many innovations in balloon designing, and he made several hundreds of balloon flights during his entire lifetime. Encountering Wise was a turning point in Andrée's life. The meeting was the starting point for his own motivation and inspiration in the field of aeronautics and ballooning. Fascinated by the new ideas, aviation, ballooning, Andrée returned to Sweden and opened own machine shop, where he worked in the early 1880s. However, Andrée's machine shop was not successful, and so he looked for work elsewhere. Now, this is another point in the story which became innovative, revolutionary in Andrée's mindset, and ultimately led him to later push the effort for his hydrogen balloon polar expedition. While working for the Swedish Royal Institute of Technology, after abandoning his machine shop, Andrée met with Niels Ekholm, a Swedish meteorologist. Ekholm was planning a geophysical expedition to Spitsbergen. Also, Andrée interested this proposed expedition and joined the scientific company, having the responsibility in observing electricity. In Ekholm, Andrée experienced him being a like-minded, one might say, an ally, as the both men believed in natural sciences and industrial development more than in art and literature. Still, Andrée differed of Ekholm, as the near future would prove, while the other gave up the expedition as a result of scientific evidence. But the other had given all his effort for the expedition and was too excited, too proud to give up. He was blinded by the prestige and let it get the better of him, which in the end proved very fatal. Anyway, around 15 years after the Svalbard experience, Andrée would make the Danes Island, next to Spitsbergen, as his starting point for the balloon expedition. Chapter 3. The first visions of the expedition. It was now 1893. Andrée had bought his first own hydrogen balloon, Svea. All in all, Andrée made a total of 9 flights on Svea, starting from either Gothenburg or Stockholm. 1,500 miles was flown in combined. Svea proved to be difficult to steer, especially in the prevailing western winds. Andrée often found himself flying Svea uncontrollably in the Baltic Sea, very near the surface, and having difficulties in the Stockholm archipelago. One of these problematic flights on Svea has been recorded for posterity. It also reflects Andrée, how far he was willing to go to improve his skills in aeronautics and to learn to fly with balloons. He set off from Stockholm in 1893, drifted across the Gulf of Bothnia in a storm, and ended up on the uninhabited Eskeren islet in Korpu, in the Turku archipelago, Grand Duchy of Finland. While landing, he was injured. Overall, the trip was pleasant and very interesting, Andrée wrote. Even before the final touches, the balloon had occasionally floated right on the surface, so that the gondola had filled with water. When Andrée tested the drag rope system in steering of a hydrogen balloon, and even though it proved to be ineffective, it still became the method he trusted in his future expedition. Nowadays, drag rope is not used at all in ballooning. No scientists, neither engineers or balloonists, support the idea. Chapter 4. Promoting, fundraising, and preparing for the expedition. As previously stated, in Sweden, the elite, intellectuals, and scientific circles would have liked to have participated and seen the country take the top spot when it comes to research and exploration in the Arctic. But pioneers, like Fridtjof Nansen, the Norwegian polar explorer, had made the neighboring country a world power, and Sweden was lacking such a leading personalities. However, the sudden winds of change created a new situation in Sweden. The government and scientific circles now funded and supported the exploration of the polar region. In addition, Andrée was a gifted speaker. He lectured diligently in favor of the establishment of the expedition and created a huge national interest in the matter. There were also new individuals raising that Andrée needed for his coming purposes. In his 20s, Niels Strindberg was a photographer and scientist from Stockholm. He had just graduated from Uppsala University and got a lecturer position at Stockholm University. Strindberg was interested in hot air ballooning, and in 1896 he traveled to Paris to study it more. Very near in the future, Strindberg would be invited to Andrée's expedition as a photographer to create a photographic record of the Arctic. It later turned out that Strindberg's personal diary, which he wrote to his fiancée, Anna Charlier, was preserved as a very important piece of evidence from Andrée's expedition. So did Andrée thrill his audience. At one night, during a speech at the Royal Swedish Academy of Science, he talked about the polar expedition balloon and what would it take from it to fulfill the requirements. It must have enough lifting power to carry 3 people and all their scientific equipment, advanced cameras for aerial photography, provisions for 4 months, and ballast, altogether about 3,000 kilograms. It must retain the gas well enough to stay aloft for 30 days. The hydrogen gas must be manufactured, and the balloon filled at the Arctic launch site. It must be at least somewhat steerable. When giving his speeches, Andrée was often over-optimistic. It was most probably due to both, his personal ambition and the fact that he wanted to influence the public and the people, to convince them of the national importance of the founding of the expedition and its departure. According to Andrée, the Arctic summer would be exceptionally suitable for ballooning and conducting an exploration. For example, a long daylight period would allow flying and making observations around the clock, which in turn would make the total length of the expedition significantly shorter. The audience was convinced by Andrée's speech. However, he never mentioned the Arctic storms, fogs generally, the weather, and the wildlife. One natural phenomenon, air humidity, which would form a heavy layer of ice on top of any flying object, was also completely obscured in Andrée's notifications. Finally, Andrée's scholarship application was accepted by the Royal Swedish Academy. He had estimated the cost of the trip to be around 131,000 kroner, which is equivalent to $1 million in today's money. The proposed expedition received a lot of attention, both in the European and American press. People wanted to read about the expedition's preparations and what the expedition assumed it would achieve. Newspaper publications fascinated people. It was a story, like directly told by Jules Verne. Chapter 5, 1896. The First Expedition Attempt. The first expedition set off from Gothenburg, Sweden, and headed towards the Arctic Ocean, further to Svalbard and the Danes' island. André had chosen his previous acquaintance, Niels Ekholm and the young Niels Strindberg, as members of the expedition. The departure took place in June 1896. The ship was called Virgo. This first expedition, its members, none of them were athletic or specialized in outdoor life. All lacked proof of physical condition. On the contrary, the team was highly competent technically and scientifically. Ekholm and André, in spite of everything, had experience from Spitsbergen, an expedition that Ekholm had led more than 10 years earlier. In particular, the purpose was to map the northern regions by aerial photography. After all, they had a hydrogen balloon and Strindberg, who was a professional photographer. It's quite hard to imagine now, but André was expecting a kind of static expedition, taking it easy and sitting on the balloon gondola most of the expedition. Unfortunately, the reality proved things quite the opposite. Modern science, or aviation, does not support André's ideas, nor his confidence that the prevailing winds, even if unfavorable, could be replaced and fine-tuned with drag ropes. This was one of André's most decisive thoughts regarding the success of the expedition, and therefore also one of the major factors leading the expedition to fail. Ernin. The Eagle was a balloon built by the Frenchman, Henri Lachambre. André had ordered Ernin from France in 1895. The balloon had a cubic content 4,800 cubic meters. The balloon was sewn in Chinese silk, where 3 layers of silk were used for the upper part. For the seams, silk thread was used, which was covered with glued silk strips. When the balloon was ready, it was varnished in several layers on both the outside and inside. Over the balloon was placed a mesh of Italian hemp, soaked in acid-free petroleum jelly to prevent moisture ingress. The net was terminated at the bottom by 48 support lines, which were connected to the support ring which carried the gondola up. To reduce the risk of ice and snow on the upper part of the balloon, a calico made of varnished silk was placed, which, with the help of the balloon's tow lines, shook off any snow and ice. The hood also provided some insulation against the sun's rays, which prevented the gas from being exposed to rapid heat changes. If the balloon is cooled below its normal temperature, it sinks, and conversely, if it is heated by solar radiation, it rises. The gondola was made of willow and cane covered with a tarpaulin. It was shaped like a cylinder with a slightly arched roof. The gondola was carried up by 6 rough ropes which were connected to the bearing ring. At observation height on the gondola roof was an elastically suspended instrument ring where the expedition's instruments were mounted. The participants' belongings were stored in the gondola, and 3 sleeping places could be arranged there. The expedition had to wait at the Danes' island for a long time. The prevailing winds were not favorable for the takeoff, but they blew directly from the north towards the hydrogen balloon hangar. Throughout the summer, the weather remained almost unchanged. In the end, the conditions overcame even André's optimism, and the expedition packed its things for the return journey. On the return journey, some irrevocable facts became apparent. Ekholm, who was a realist, he had still observed Ernin's behavior and its characteristics at the Arctic. It turned out that even he had been overly optimistic about how well the gas pumped into Ernin would survive inside the balloon. Based on the calculations, Ernin leaked a lot. Every day it lost about 70 kilograms of lifting power. Ekholm checked his calculations and found out that with the loss in question, Ernin would not stay in the air long enough to reach the North Pole. not to mention Russia or Canada. He warned Andrée that he would completely withdraw from the expedition in the future if Ernen was not replaced with a balloon that would not leak so badly. Andrée did not take the warnings seriously. Ekholm made the final decision to abandon the expedition after hearing that Andrée had acted dishonestly and disrespectfully at the Danes Islands. Depending on different sources, Ekholm heard from the chief engineer of the Spitsbergen hydrogen plant that Andrée had either secretly ordered extra topping up of Ernen or pumped gas into the hot air balloons secretly to cover up and hide the true extent of Ernen's gas leaks. Ultimately, the results of his calculations and Andrée being unwilling to do the asked replacements and changes, Ekholm decided to withdraw from Andrée's polar project. Chapter 6, 1897, the second expedition attempt. After the first attempt was called off, the general and public enthusiasm and interest in the expedition decreased, but still, there were enough candidates and applicants to replace the retired Ekholm. Among them, Andrée chose Knut Frenkel. Frenkel was an engineer and had a military training background. Unlike Andrée and Strindberg, Frenkel had served in the Swedish armed forces. He was physically strong, under 30 years old, and used to outdoor life, especially mountain hiking. In that sense, Frenkel was an excellent choice. He brought additional expertise to the expedition, which was otherwise technically and scientifically strong. The downside was that Frenkel was passionate, more than sensible. Andrée had probably counted on that when choosing Frenkel. He would strengthen his own position, now that the authoritative Ekholm had been replaced by the young, inspired Frenkel. The 1897 expedition members would now be S.A. Andrée, Niels Strindberg, and Knut Frenkel. When the team arrived again to the Danes Island, they of course checked the balloon hangar. Surprisingly, it had stood well and wintered against the Arctic weather. Also, the blowing winds were now more favorable than during the previous attempt. At these friendly conditions, the team's spirits were rising, having hopes of succeeding to complete the expedition. On July 11th, the winds were blowing from the south. 3 brave explorers boarded Ernen's gondola. The roof of the hangar was open. Still a few moments. Andrée used the last minutes. He wrote 2 telegrams, one to King Oscar and the other to the Swedish newspaper, Aftonbladet, which had exclusive rights to the newspaper publications of the expedition. A large crowd had come to watch the departure. It helped to break the ropes that kept Ernen in the hangar. Slowly, this heavily loaded balloon rose, higher and higher, over the open roof of the hangar. Ernen was moving out now, but barely above the sea level. The drag ropes, meant for steering, were several hundred meters long, and they weighed a lot, even so much that they pulled the balloon basket to touch the water. In order to get higher, the team had no chance than to unscrew and dump most of the drag ropes and sandbags. This measure made Ernen to climb altitude, but too much. The optimal flight height would have been 150 meters, but Ernen now rose to 700 meters above sea level. In the high atmosphere, Ernen also leaked hydrogen faster. It was now clear for everyone, for the members and the audience on land. While a lot of cargo and the ballast was thrown away, Ernen had lost its maneuverability and was at the mercy of the winds. The start of the expedition had not looked at good at all, and it all happened during the first half of an hour. Ernen was now on its way north. The expedition was able to communicate abroad with carrier pigeons, for example. Aftonbladet newspaper had provided pigeons for the expedition. Andrée sent 4 of those during the flight, but only one of them was found. The following message was found with the pigeon. Our journey goes well so far. We sail at an altitude of about 250 meters. At first north, 10 degrees east, but later end 45 degrees east. Weather delightful. Spirits high. However, there is reason to doubt the truthfulness of the message. The flight was very chaotic, harsh, and difficult. The members of the expedition hardly slept at all during the flight. In total, the balloon journey lasted for 51 hours and 29 minutes. Free flying lasted just over 10 hours. The final of the flight was bumpy and very stressful, as the balloon kept touching the surface of the ice all the time that it can hardly even be called as flying. Finally, the inevitable happened. About 3 days after departure, on July 14th, Ernan crashed on the surface of the ice and did not continue its flight. The crash seemed to have happened gently. None of the members of the expedition was injured in the collision. At least there is no mention of such a thing. When the expedition made the emergency landing on the ice, Andrée must have known that they would not reach the North Pole. The team now had a few options. Both Franz Josef Land and the northern part of Svalbard were known to have supplies and food caches. Those had been taken there in advance in case of emergencies. The expedition decided to try for Franz Josef's Land. Chapter 7. The Expedition on Foot, on Ice. If it already wasn't challenging enough, the journey on the ice was the point when the extreme afflictions started plague Andrée's expedition. The decision to try Franz Josef Land did not come in a moment. Before setting off, the expedition spent a week on the Arctic sea ice in a tent. The men tried to come up with the best solution. At the same time, they prepared to cross the ice on foot. The journey would be very difficult and painful in any case. The danger, of course, was that they wouldn't make it out alive. In addition to the harsh climate, wild animals, especially polar bears, were a risk. There was one good side to the matter. The expedition was well equipped for emergencies. The men had plenty of food with them. They had weapons, a camera for photography, observation equipment, binoculars and compasses, watches. All the equipment was transported forward along the ice in a sledge, one of which was part of the equipment. It would also function as a small boat when crossing open water spots if necessary. On July 22nd, the decision was ready. They had overloaded 2 sleds. The weight in them was almost 200 kilograms. The journey into the unknown began. Its length was almost 750 kilometers. It was the middle of summer, July-August. However, the Arctic climate was harsh and wintry. The wind swept over the ice and the glacier, and it bit unpleasantly on the men's faces. You could imagine that the sea ice is flat and smooth. However, that was not the case. The surface was uneven. The snow slowed down the progress. Sometimes there were cracks. Sometimes there was a vertical wall of ice in front, which the men had to go around. It soon became clear that the sleds were far too heavily packed. It was almost hopeless to pull them uphill. On the downhill, there was a risk that the grip on the sled would slip, and the sled could break when it stopped and collided with the ice wall. The men struggled forward in extreme fatigue and blinded by the snow. The expedition also encountered wild animals of the polar region. The men shot polar bears and walruses for food. It didn't take long. After the men had started the journey, they realized that the struggle against the nature would hardly take them to the destination, Franz Josef Land. By the 4th of August, they had already expended a tremendous amount of energy fighting in inhumane conditions. But with the current carried the ice in the wrong direction, the expedition had drifted further away rather than getting closer to their goal. It was at this point they decided to rethink an alternative direction, back to Svalbard, wishing the current would make them closer to the islands. At first, it seemed that the plan would work, but then the wind changed, and the current took them in the wrong direction again. On September 12th, the expedition decided to camp, wasting no more energy walking, but threw themselves completely at the mercy of nature, letting the currents and the wind carry them. After being on the ice for about 2.5 months, the expedition ended up in Kvitoya, the White Island. Chapter 8. The End. Something strange and mysterious has happened to the expedition, either just before arriving at White Island or right after arriving there. On the other hand, it is possible that it could be something that has had an effect even longer. Andrée's diary entries show that the men were happy to have land under their feet and that morale and spirits were high. However, the last of Strindberg's diary entries was on October 7th, the day after arriving on the island. Andrée's last diary entry is recorded on October 8th. It is also worth noting that his handwriting had clearly deteriorated. It can refer simply to fatigue or to some illness. In any case, shortly after its departure, in July 1897, nothing was heard from Andrée's expedition, and it disappeared for 33 years. The rediscovery of the expedition happened completely by chance. In 1930, as a result of a warmer summer, the so-called Brattvåg expedition had come to White Island to catch seals and walruses. The crew continued to hunt walruses on land, and soon they noticed a piece of metal glinting in the snow cover. That caught their attention, and the crew began to investigate further. A boat was revealed under the snow. It was loaded with goods, among which an anchor was found, and it read, "Andrée's Polar Expedition, 1896. So the boat was the sledge that Andrée's expedition had pulled across the ice. Next, a partial skeleton of a man was found nearby. It was buried in ice and snow. The skeleton was wearing a jacket. Based on its initials, the skeleton was assumed to be Andrée. Empty morphine bottles were also found next to it. It seemed that the end of the expedition leader had been painfully difficult. A few hundred meters away, a stone cairn was found with a skull on top. The mound was presumably a grave that had been disturbed by animals. The rest of the skeleton was found under a pile of stones. The initials on the clothing revealed that it was Niels Strindberg. Frankel's remains were found a month later, in September, when more snow and ice had melted on the island. Probably almost everything that the expedition had left in 1897 when it arrived at White Island was rediscovered in 1930. The incident became world news. The causes of death of the members of the expedition were investigated, but it has still not been clarified. The diet may be one reason. It may also be the harsh stresses of the trip, or polar bear attacks. The order of death, on the other hand, is clearer. Strindberg died first, then Frankel and Andrée last. In 1930, the remains of the expedition members were first transported to Norway and then to Sweden. In Sweden, a state funeral was organized. It was a very solemn occasion with the greatest honors. At the same time, national heroes were visibly mourned. Only later research, starting in the 1960s, began to question Andrée's motives in more detail. Nowadays, it is believed that Andrée was well aware of the risks of the expedition, but did not care about the warnings. He had become a prisoner of his own thoughts. An expedition inspired by national pride led to the disappearance of the team and the perishing of all its 3 members. You have been listening and watching to Salomon August Andrée's 1897 failed expedition to the North Pole by Premium Tales, Hooking Stories.